The first thing Yara noticed when the world slowed down was how beautiful it was. Not slow like a dream, slow like everything else had finally caught up to her. The flechette round from the Vael commander's sidearm hung in the air 6 centimeters from her left eye, spinning lazily, its ceramic tip reflecting the amber emergency lighting of the corridor in a way that should have been terrifying. Instead, she stood there, breathing, watching the microvortex of disturbed air curl away from it like smoke from a candle. She had time to notice the fluted grooves along its body. Time to think. Someone machined that. Someone on the other side of the galaxy sat down and designed the shape of the thing that was supposed to end her. She stepped aside. The flechette passed close enough to her cheek that she felt a faint tug, like a finger drawing across skin. Behind her, it punched through a ventilation panel with a sound like a staple gun. The Vael commander, all 2.8 meters of it, black-jointed, 4-eyed, made a sound she had come to understand as confusion. In 17 months of war, the Vael had never had to make that sound twice about the same human. They catalogued you in the first exchange, and after that, their fire was perfect. They did not miss. The math was too good. Until 8 weeks ago, they had not understood that humans could be given better math. Yara rolled her shoulder, felt the familiar twitch at the base of her skull where the graft socket had healed over, and brought her sidearm up. "I see it," said Dex, somewhere behind her. "I know," she said, and fired. The program was called Threshold. That was the word Specialist Yara Osei had read on the document folder before the surgical briefing officer told her to stop reading and sign the consent form. She'd signed it anyway, pen moving, before she'd fully processed what she was agreeing to. 14 other soldiers had done the same in that room, all of them sitting in the kind of institutional chairs that seemed specifically designed to make you feel mortal. She'd looked at the man to her left, heavyset, calm, picking dried mud from the heel of his boot with a thumbnail, and thought, he doesn't know what he's signing either. Neither do I. That's probably fine. It wasn't fine. It was the most significant decision she had ever made in her life. The night before the surgery, Specialist Dex Palaro had come to her bunk with 2 packets of protein rations, the good kind with the fake coffee flavoring, and sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his legs stretched out and said, "Last chance." She'd taken the packet he offered, felt its warmth through the mylar. Last chance for what? To not do this, to stay the same. She'd looked at him. He was broad-shouldered, 2 years younger than her, perpetually tired-looking even when he wasn't tired. He had a habit of going very still when he was thinking. He was very still now. "If I stay the same," she said, "I die at the speed the Vael intend." Dex was quiet for a moment. Then, "And if you don't stay the same?" She thought about the briefing. The threshold concept, a neural interface graft, embedded at the brainstem that intercepted the visual processing pathway and introduced synthetic lag, not in the subject's perception, but in the subject's experience of their own perception. The brain was already processing incoming sensory faster than conscious experience could represent it. Threshold exploited that gap. It took the raw signal, the thing the brain had already understood, and delivered it to conscious awareness as ahead of schedule. What emerged was not actually slowing the world down. It was the opposite. It was speeding up the person receiving it, not by altering their body, but by removing the delay between the world and their understanding of it. The Vael fired their weapons at speeds calibrated to what humans were capable of reacting to. They had done the math. They had been, for 17 months, correct. Threshold was a new variable in their equation. "I don't know," Yara had said honestly and drank her fake coffee. She still didn't know what she was, exactly, but she was harder to kill than she'd been before. That seemed, in the present circumstances, like enough. They woke her in a tank. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected a surgical suite, white lights, the hiss of anesthetic. Instead, she became aware. Gradually, the way a tide comes in warm fluid up to her collarbones, with tubes running from her forearms and the back of her neck and somewhere along her spine that she couldn't see and was trying very hard not to think about. The light was low and orange. Someone was speaking, though it took a while to understand that the words were meant for her. "OC, you're clear. We're going to bring you up." The fluid drained. It made a sound she would spend a long time trying not to remember. The person helping her out of the tank was a medical tech named Reyes, who had the particular professional warmth of someone who has helped a lot of frightened people climb out of tanks full of biofluid and has learned to project calm without making it feel performed. She handed Yara a thermal wrap and didn't say anything about the way Yara's hands were shaking, which Yara was grateful for. "It worked?" Yara asked. "All 14 grafts took." Reyes was checking a readout on a tablet. "You're the last one up. Palaro's been asking about you every 20 minutes for 3 hours. What did you tell him? That you were fine. Was that true?" Reyes looked at her. "It is now." She found Dex in the corridor outside, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes closed, and she stood in front of him for a moment without speaking, and he opened his eyes and looked at her, and she could see him working through the same question she was asking herself. "Are you still the same person?" She didn't know how to answer it. She thought the honest answer was, mostly the same. But with a door in the back of her mind that hadn't been there before, and behind it, the world as it actually was, before her brain had been finished deciding what to do with it. "You look terrible," he said. "I feel strange. Strange like the lights in here are too loud." She paused. "That doesn't make sense." "No," he agreed, and pushed off the wall and fell into desk beside her. "But we're both still walking, so..." She nodded once. They walked. The Vael occupation of Station Meridian 7 had been total and efficient. In 4 hours, they had taken a platform that housed 900 humans and established control nodes at every access corridor, communications bay, and docking hardpoint. They left the humans alive because the Vael understood the value of leverage and had a sophisticated concept of what made a useful prisoner. They were very good at occupation. They had practiced on 43 other human installations in the previous 14 months. What they had not practiced was having their parameters change midway through. Yara and Dex had been inserted via a cargo docking sleeve on the station's underside, which the Vael had not secured because it was rated for freight tonnage that would require machinery the Vael had already destroyed. What the Vael had not accounted for was that a person could fit through a freight sleeve if they removed their outer equipment layer and breathed in. Neither Yara nor Dex had enjoyed this. Both of them had done it without comment, because the mission required it, and there was nothing useful to say about things the mission required. Inside the station, they found a locker bay 2 levels below the main operations deck. They dressed in silence. Game faces, Yara thought, looking at herself in the scratched mirror above the lockers. Whatever that means now. Dex handed her a sidearm and a collapsible long arm he'd extracted from the gear tube, and she checked both with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done the same motion 1,000 times, because she had done it 1,000 times, and it was one of the things that still felt the same. She slung the long arm across her back. He adjusted the strap on his own rifle, looked at her once. She nodded. They walked out of the locker bay and into the Vael-occupied station as though they owned it, because looking like you owned something was the oldest human trick in the book and had worked so many times throughout history on so many different opponents that she had long ago stopped questioning why it worked and simply accepted that it did. They were 3 corridors from their first objective when a Vael sentry registered them. Yara felt it before she saw it. A perceptual shift at the edge of her vision, the world drawing a quiet breath before something happened. The sentry was bringing up its weapon, a long, triple-barreled apparatus. The Vael called a resonance lance, though humans called it something less dignified, and the motion, which would have been nearly invisible at operational speed, unfolded for her like a slow curtain being drawn aside. She saw each component of it: the arm extension, the weapon's barrel clearing its resting position, the crystalline firing chamber beginning to charge, the faint blue luminescence inside the barrel that preceded a shot. She had perhaps 300 milliseconds of real time in which to act. In her experience of it, she had several seconds. She sidestepped. She covered Dex with her body. He hadn't seen it yet, and drew her sidearm in the same motion and put 2 rounds into the sentry's firing chamber before it discharged. The resonance lance made a sound like breaking glass and went dark. The sentry looked at her with 2 of its 4 eyes, the expression unreadable by human standards, though she had spent enough time in the field to interpret the posture. It was recalibrating, running new numbers, arriving at a conclusion it did not like. She shot it twice more. It went down. Dex had his weapon up now. He looked at her, then at the sentry on the floor. "Timing," he said. "I know." They kept moving. The Vael command node for Meridian 7 was in the operations center on the station's primary level. Yara and Dex needed to reach it, disable the transmission array it was using to coordinate the occupation, and hold position long enough for the extraction team to get Morpheus 7. Their term for the ranking prisoner being held on this station, a signals intelligence officer whose brain contained 3 months of intercept data out through the same freight sleeve they'd come in through. The problem was the corridor between their current position and the operations center contained 6 Vael infantry in defensive posture and a Vael enforcer, which was a different classification of being entirely. Enforcers were larger, faster, more heavily armored. The Vael used them the way humans used landmines. You placed them where you needed something to stop, and it stopped. Yara stood at the junction with Dex and looked at the corridor. 6 plus the enforcer, Dex said. His voice was steady. This was one of the things about him she had catalogued and kept. His voice was always steady, not because he wasn't afraid. She knew he was afraid, but because he had decided at some point she hadn't witnessed that his voice was not going to be the thing that broke. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Probably not," she said. "I'm thinking we go through the maintenance shaft to the left, flank around. I'm thinking we go through them." Silence. "Through them," he repeated. "The enforcer will be a problem," she said. "The 6 infantry are not a problem. Not anymore. I can thread the corridor. You hold center and pick up anything that comes up on my blind side. You've done this once. I've done the lab trials. That's not the same." "No," she agreed. "It's less stressful." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running the calculation, not the numbers, which he knew as well as she did, but the one underneath the numbers. Do I trust her? Not in the abstract. In this corridor in the next 2 minutes, with her making decisions at speeds he couldn't fully follow. He let his breath out. "I've got your blind side," he said. They walked around the corner. What happened next would be, later, difficult to describe in language calibrated to normal human experience. Because the language was built to describe things happening at the speed things normally happened, and what Yara experienced in that corridor happened at a different scale entirely. The first 2 Vael infantry brought their weapons up. She read the motion before it completed and was already moving. A lateral slip that took her out of both firing solutions simultaneously, and she fired twice as she moved, not aimed in the way training had taught her, but only now had always been trying to, and only now could actually access. each round arriving exactly where it needed to arrive. Both soldiers down. A resonance lance fired. The beam passed through the space she'd occupied half a second prior, struck the far wall, and left a scorch mark shaped like an open hand. She was already past it. Third and fourth soldiers. One she put down at range. One she had to close with, which she did inside the arc of its weapon, where it couldn't bring the lance to bear, where it was suddenly dealing with a human at close quarters who knew exactly what it was about to do and had already decided what to do about that. A strike to the joint where its upper firing limb met the torso. A follow-through. She had practiced the joint anatomy in training, and the practice had lived in her muscles all this time, and now her muscles were finally fast enough to use it. She rolled off the falling body. The fifth was the problem she'd expected from the fifth. It had moved to a new position in the time it had taken her to process 1 through 4, and its new position was good. She had perhaps a sliver of exposure, and it had a clear angle. She took the exposure, betting her sliver against its certainty. It fired. She had seen flechettes in slow motion before. In the tank session, in the lab, before she understood what she was seeing, she understood now. The round came toward her, and she experienced it the way she had experienced the one in the corridor earlier. A thing caught between instants, beautiful in a completely clinical way, possessed of a geometry she could read. She was already moving when it reached her. It grazed her upper arm. She felt it, a line of heat, not deep, and she put it out of her mind immediately because the sixth soldier was to her right, and she needed to be somewhere else within the next fraction of a second. She was. The sixth went down. The enforcer was at the end of the corridor. It was watching her. It was very large, and its 4 eyes did not show confusion. The Vael enforcer class did not experience confusion in any register she had learned to read. What it showed was something she hadn't seen on a Vael face before, and it took her a moment. Her body still humming from the run, her perception still stretched wide and cool, to recognize what it was. Calculation. Not the routine kind. The kind you did when the current model had stopped working and you needed a new one. It had just watched a human walk through 6 of its infantry. It was deciding what kind of thing she was. She gave it a second. Let it look. Then she raised her sidearm and aimed it directly at the enforcer's primary optical cluster. Not because she thought the shot would kill it, but because she had learned in 17 months of war that the Vael did not like being looked at down a barrel. It was something about the geometry of it, something their cognition processed as a specific kind of challenge. 3 ways out of this corridor, she said. You, me, or we figure something else out. The enforcer looked at her for a long, strange moment. Then it moved aside. She walked past it. Dex fell into step beside her. She hadn't heard him coming, but that was Dex. He moved quietly even when he was moving fast. He looked at her arm where the flechette had grazed it. She shook her head slightly. Later. The enforcer, he said. I know, that's never happened. I know. They kept walking. The operations center was unlocked, which was itself a kind of statement. The Vael had not locked it because the Vael had no framework in which it needed to be locked. Their security posture was built on the assumption that nothing human could reach it. She put her palm on the access panel and let herself in, and the familiar pulse at her brainstem registered the room in a sweep before she'd consciously looked at it. 2 Vael operators at consoles, 1 Vael command class in the center of the room, the transmission array in the upper alcove, and against the far wall, restrained in a Vael containment frame, a human figure in torn signals uniform. The command class turned to face her. It was tall, old. For a Vael, she could read age in the coloration of the upper integument, the slight stiffness in the secondary arm joints. It wore rank markings she had studied from field intelligence reports. It had run this occupation. It had run many occupations before this one. It looked at her the way the enforcer had, with the specific interest of a thing encountering a new variable. "You are the threshold program," it said. Its translator was good. The Vael had invested in translation because understanding the humans they were fighting was something they had identified, early, as tactically important. "We have heard reports. We assessed a probability of less than 4% that the procedure would yield field-capable subjects within this engagement window." "Sounds like you need to update your numbers," she said. "We already have." It looked at her steadily. "I wish to understand something. The neural modification you carry, you chose it. You accepted an alteration to your cognition, your perception, your fundamental experience of your own existence. We have studied your species extensively. Humans do not do this easily. It goes against strong instincts." She thought of the surgical briefing, the consent form signed before she'd finished reading, the fake coffee in the dark with Dex's quiet voice asking, "Last chance. We do it when we have to," she said. "No," the command class said. "Other species do it when they have to. Humans do it willingly, eagerly. You modified yourselves. You accepted the risk of the modification failing. You woke up in tanks and adapted and came here and walked through my infantry." It paused. "Why?" She looked at the person against the far wall, the signals officer, the person who had the intercept data, who had held on to it for 3 months inside a Vael containment system. She looked at the officer's face, bruised, exhausted, looking back at her with the particular expression of someone who has been in a bad situation long enough that they have stopped expecting to be found, and are now discovering that the expectation was wrong. She thought about what to say. Then she thought, there's nothing to say that would mean anything to this thing. It's asking why as a tactical question. It doesn't have the context to understand that the answer is not tactical. "Get the officer," she said to Dex, and she shot the transmission array. The extraction was not clean, but it was successful, which, in Yara's experience, was the realistic goal. Clean was what you planned for. Successful was what you achieved. Dex had the signals officer moving within 90 seconds of entering the operations room. Yara held the rear, navigating them back to the freight docking sleeve by a combination of what she'd memorized going in and what her modified cognition was processing in real time from every sound and light and subtle shift in air pressure in the corridors around her. The Vael had responded to the loss of their transmission array by shifting to localized coordination, which was slower and noisier. She heard them moving 2 corridors over, running new calculations, adjusting formation. They were fast, but she had the corridor geometry in her head, and she was faster in the ways that mattered. At the junction near the locker bay, a Vael patrol came around a corner ahead of them, and the world stretched out the way it always did now. Her perception meeting the situation before her conscious mind had finished reading it, and she saw the space between her and them, and the angles and the fractions of seconds. And she knew, with the cold clarity that the graph had given her, and that she suspected she would carry for the rest of her life, whether she wanted to or not, exactly what was possible. A lot was possible. That was the thing no one had fully told her. Not the briefing, not the consent form, not even Reyes with her quiet professional warmth in the recovery room. The graft didn't just make her faster. It made the world legible in a way it hadn't been. It was like she had tried to explain it to Dex in the days after recovery and couldn't, and she tried again now in the back of her mind as she moved. It was like her whole life she had been reading a page through frosted glass, making out shapes, inferring words, guessing context. And now the glass was gone, and the page said, "You can do this." She took the patrol apart in 11 seconds. They reached the freight sleeve. Dex helped the signals officer through first. The officer was weak, and the sleeve required the upper body work of a pull. And Yara watched Dex coax the officer through with a patience that would have surprised most people who only knew Dex in a firefight. She had stopped being surprised by it years ago. He was like that. He showed you one thing under pressure, and a different thing when the pressure was redistributed. She took one last look back down the corridor, empty, but not silent. She could hear, deep in the station's structure, the Vael recalibrating, the sound of a machine updating its model, running new parameters, arriving at conclusions about humans that the Vael had not needed to arrive at before. She thought about the command class asking her, why? She still didn't have an answer for it. Not the kind the command class had been asking for, but she had what she'd come with. The mission objective achieved. 2 people breathing who needed to be breathing, and the knowledge that somewhere in the Vael command architecture, a calculation had been revised. They had gone into their math. They had found a margin where she could exist. She had changed the margin. She went through the sleeve. The debrief took 4 hours and covered things she was too tired to engage with fully. And then it was over, and she was sitting in the corridor outside the debrief room, with her back against the wall and her legs stretched out, and Dex sat down beside her. And someone who was not either of them had managed to produce 2 packets of protein rations, the bad kind, this time without the coffee flavor, but warm. And he handed her one, and she took it, and they sat there in the corridor of whatever ship they'd been extracted to, eating rations that tasted like industrial insulation, not talking. After a while, Dex said, "The arm grazed," she said. "I know. I meant, did you feel it happening?" She thought about it, the flechette catching her upper arm, the line of heat, the fact that she had already been moving, already had the 4th and 5th soldiers in her processing arc, already filed the graze away as not lethal, and continued. "No," she said. "Not really. Not until after." "Is that?" He stopped, started again. "I don't know how to ask this. Ask anyway. Is that good, that you didn't feel it until after?" She looked at the ration packet in her hands, turned it over. The miler caught the corridor light. "I don't know," she said. "I think it's just what it is." He nodded slowly, the way he did when he was accepting information he wasn't fully sure about. It was one of his tells, not the head movement, but the quality of the stillness that followed it, like he was filing something, not throwing it away. "The enforcer," he said, when it moved aside. "Yeah. What do you think that was?" She had been thinking about it. The command class's question, why? The enforcer's long look, and then the small, strange step sideways. The Vael ran their arithmetic on humanity, and it came up the same every time. "We know what you are capable of. We have calibrated accordingly. The math says you lose." And in that corridor, the math had looked at her and come up with a different answer. And the enforcer had read the answer on its own display and processed it in whatever way the enforcer class processed things that fell outside previous parameters. The Vael were brilliant. They were organized. They were fast and merciless and had no illusions about the war they were fighting. In 17 months, they had taken 44 installations and lost nothing significant. They had updated their models about humanity 6 times, always accounting for new human capabilities, always arriving at the same structural conclusion. Humans were finite. Humans were soft. Humans were limited by the speed of the world as humans experienced it. What they hadn't accounted for was that humans were willing to change the experience, that humans would volunteer, would sign forms without finishing them, would lie in tanks full of biofluid while something altered the substrate of their cognition, and wake up shaking and find each other in corridors and ask, "Are you still the same person?" and not have a complete answer and go anyway. "I think," she said carefully, "that it saw something it hadn't modeled for, and it didn't know what to do with that." "Not yet," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not yet is a good phrase. They'll update. They always update. Sure. He shifted against the wall, pulled his legs in. But this time we update first. She thought about the world at full speed. The ordinary speed she'd lived at for 28 years, where bullets happened before you knew they were coming, and the Vael fired with the calm certainty of beings who had measured the gap between reality and human experience and found it wide enough to kill you inside of. She thought about the door in the back of her mind, the world behind the frosted glass. There was no bullet until you knew about it. That was the thing. That was the thing she couldn't have explained to the command class, even if she'd wanted to. The bullet existed. The Vael fired it. But between the firing and the arriving, there was a moment, a gap, a corridor of time that the world had always been trying to show her, where it was still just physics, still just trajectory, still just a problem with a solution if you could get there fast enough to call it a problem first. They'd built her a door to that corridor. She intended to use it. Dex had his eyes closed, shoulders relaxed, the pack of rations going cool in his hands. He wasn't sleeping. She could tell by his breathing. But he was doing the thing he did, where he had stepped back from the edge of a situation he couldn't hold anymore, filed what was fileable, and let the rest sit. She had always thought that was one of the bravest things about him. Braver, maybe, than anything she'd done in that corridor today. Walking into a firefight with modified perception was a matter of capability. Deciding to put something down because you couldn't carry it all was a different kind of strength. She leaned her head back against the bulkhead. Somewhere in the Vael network, she knew, a new calculation was running, new parameters being entered. The question was the same question it always had been, only now it had a different set of inputs. What is the human capable of? What margin do we need to kill it? The Vael would find an answer. They were very good at finding answers. She didn't have any illusions about that. But she was very tired of giving them easy math. Through the viewport at the end of the corridor, small, scratched, the ship's running lights, making a faint halo on the glass, she could see open space. Stars. The distant orange smear of the station they'd just left. The Vael still in it, recalibrating in the dark. Out there, 44 installations. The installations had people in them. People still on the original side of the glass, seeing the world the way the Vael had measured the world seeing it, slow, reactive. Inside the margins, the Vael had decided were permanent. The surgery had taken 14 volunteers, a long way from 44 installations, a long way from a war. But 17 months ago, the Vael had needed 0 new calculations. Now they were writing one. She finished her rations, put the empty packet in her jacket pocket the way she always did, Simi always did, some old training about not leaving trace evidence that had become habit-like. Most things that started as training. Dex had done the same with his. She noticed this and was briefly, obscurely moved by it, that they had both kept this small automatic habit, this nothing gesture, this piece of who they'd been before the tank grabbed and the corridor where time slowed and the world was legible and a Vael enforcer had stepped aside. Some things didn't change when you changed. Maybe that was the answer to the command class's question. The one she hadn't been able to give it. Not the why of the modification, the surgery, the tank, the consent form signed in haste, but the why underneath that. The humans kept going through tanks and coming out on the other side, because underneath all of it, past the graft and the training, and the 17 months of math they'd been losing, there were still 2 people sitting in a corridor eating bad rations and keeping a habit about not leaving trace evidence that neither of them would ever be able to fully explain, still themselves. That was the part the Vael couldn't model. Not because it was beyond their intelligence. They were brilliant. They would probably find a way to model it eventually, when they had enough data. But right now, tonight, They were still running calculations on a version of humanity that no longer existed, and she was going to be very hard to kill in the interval. She closed her eyes. The stars kept burning.